The diamonds sparkled under the showroom lights as I closed another $1 million deal, but the commission couldn't fill the void that had been growing in my chest for months. At 35, I was the youngest female diamond merchant on 47th Street, the pride of my father, Rabbi Goldstein's legacy, yet I felt like I was suffocating behind these gleaming display cases. Another excellent month, Leah. My father beamed as he reviewed the sales figures, his prayer shawl still draped over his shoulders from afternoon prayers. The Rosenbergs are asking when you'll finally settle down. Their son David just finished his residency. Abba, please. I turned away, pretending to reorganize the emerald-cut displays. This conversation had become our weekly ritual, as predictable as Shabbat candles. At 35, I was practically a spinster by Orthodox standards, a source of whispered concern among the synagogue women and growing frustration for my parents. The truth was more complicated than anyone suspected. I'd had my chances, 3 serious courtships arranged by the Shadchan, each ending when the men realized I wasn't the compliant Orthodox wife they'd expected. I asked too many questions, challenged too many assumptions, ran my business with an independence that made them uncomfortable. The last one, Mordecai, had actually told my father I was too modern for a proper Jewish home. But it wasn't just the failed matches that kept me awake at night. It was the questions that had been multiplying like cracks in precious stone, threatening to shatter everything I'd built my life upon. Our family's diamond business had flourished under my leadership, expanding from my grandfather's tiny shop to a premier showroom in Manhattan's Diamond District. Every Friday night, I hosted elaborate Shabbat dinners for rabbinical students and community leaders, my table laden with traditional dishes prepared exactly as my mother had taught me before the cancer took her 5 years ago. The empty chair at the head of my table served as a constant reminder of the family I should have started by now. From the outside, my life looked enviable. I funded the new wing of our synagogue, taught modesty classes to young women, and maintained our family's reputation for honest business dealings. My father beamed with pride whenever he introduced me to visiting scholars. "My daughter," he would say, "she keeps our traditions alive better than most sons." But late at night, when I returned to my Upper West Side apartment scandalously living alone, another source of community concern, questions would surface that no amount of religious devotion could silence. Where was the Messiah our people had waited for these thousands of years? How many more generations would pass before the promise was fulfilled? And why did I feel so spiritually empty despite following every law, every custom, every tradition with meticulous care? I threw myself deeper into ritual observance, hoping to drown out these doubts with familiar rhythms. Each morning I wrapped myself in devotion like a prayer shawl, reciting the prayers with perfect pronunciation. I kept kosher with militant precision, observed every fast day, attended every service. Yet the questions persisted, like a small stone in my shoe that I couldn't shake loose. The crack in my carefully constructed world had appeared during last year's Passover Seder, as I recited the ancient words about the blood of the Lamb that saved our people in Egypt. Alone in my apartment since no family would invite an unmarried woman to host, my voice faltered. A thought rose unbidden. If the blood sacrifice was truly finished, why did we still wait for redemption? I pushed the question away, but it echoed in my mind as I led the younger women in their Torah studies each Wednesday evening. They looked up to me as a model of success, the unmarried businesswoman who proved you could be both modern and devout. "Leah has everything," I'd overheard Rachel Stern tell her daughter. "She just needs to find the right man to complete her happiness." If they could have seen inside my heart, they would have glimpsed the growing void that no amount of diamonds, no community respect, no business success could fill. Each morning, as I opened the heavy steel doors to our showroom, I felt like I was unlocking more than just our precious inventory. Something was stirring in my soul, a hunger for truth that all my wealth and status couldn't satisfy. The loneliness was the worst part. Not just the empty apartment or the pitying looks from married women, but the spiritual isolation of questioning everything that defined my identity. During last month's Rosh Hashanah services, as we prayed for our names to be written in the Book of Life, I found myself wondering if mine ever had been. The ritual felt hollow, like going through motions without meaning. My father often said that questions strengthen faith, but these felt different. They threatened the very foundation of everything I had built my life upon. When Mrs. Goldberg cornered me after services to suggest her nephew from Chicago, a successful accountant, very observant, I almost screamed. How could I marry someone when I wasn't even sure what I believed anymore? I never imagined then how my search for answers would shatter every certainty I held dear, or that the price of finding truth would cost me not just my position, but nearly my life itself. Looking back now, I see that Hashem was already at work, preparing me for a journey that would transform everything, starting with my understanding of who the Messiah really was. But on that autumn evening, as I locked away millions in diamonds and headed home for another solitary Shabbat, I was still Leah, successful, respected, spiritually starving, and desperately alone. The questions that would change my life were just beginning to surface, like the first tremors before an earthquake. I never expected a health scare to introduce me to the most dangerous person I'd ever meet. But there I was at 3 a.m, watching a Christian nurse tend to my father with a kind of love that defied everything I'd been taught about Goyim, the kind of love that would eventually cost me everything I held dear. The emergency room had been chaos. My father's massive heart attack had struck without warning during his evening Torah study. As we rushed through traffic, I'd made bargains with God I'd never thought I'd make. Take my business, take anything, just don't take him too. He was all the family I had left, the only person who still believed I could find my place in our tradition despite my stubborn independence. The cardiac unit was where I first encountered Harriet Martinez, the night nurse who would unwittingly become the catalyst for my spiritual demolition. There was something different about her, a peace that seemed to radiate from within despite the chaos of critical care. While other staff appeared exhausted and irritable during the long night shifts, she moved with quiet purpose, speaking gentle words of comfort in perfect Hebrew that stunned me.
Shalom Aleichem,
She said softly as she checked my father's monitors. How are you holding up? I stared at her. You speak Hebrew? I study it to better understand the Tanakh, she replied, adjusting my father's oxygen levels with practiced care. The prophets especially. Isaiah gives me chills every time. My Orthodox alarm bells started ringing. I knew exactly where this was going. I'd dealt with missionaries before, with their clumsy attempts to convince Jews that their rabbi from Nazareth was somehow our Messiah. But when I found Harriet in the break room reading Isaiah 53, something different happened. She wasn't trying to convert me. She was simply reading, tears streaming down her face. These words, she whispered when she saw me watching. They break my heart every time. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. That passage isn't about Jesus, I snapped, the familiar argument rising to my lips. It's about Israel's suffering among the nations. She looked up at me with such gentleness that my anger wavered. I used to think that too. But then I realized, when did Israel's suffering ever heal anyone else? When did our wounds ever make the nations whole? I walked away furious, but her question haunted me. During sleepless nights by my father's bedside, I found myself returning to the prophecy I'd studied since childhood, the suffering servant who would bear the sins of many, cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of his people. Why hadn't I ever noticed how individual the language was? Harriet never pushed, never preached. She simply served with inexplicable love, checking on my father with a gentleness that made no sense for someone who barely knew us. When I snapped at her one particularly difficult night, "Why do you even care? We're not your people," she just smiled sadly. "The same blood that covered the doorposts in Egypt covers every sin completely," she said softly. "That makes us more than family." I wanted to argue, but the conviction in her voice stopped me cold. During my father's long recovery, I found myself studying Harriet more than I cared to admit. Her joy seemed to come from somewhere deeper than circumstances. Even during the worst shifts, dealing with death and suffering, she carried a peace I'd never encountered in any of my religious friends. One evening, I couldn't contain my curiosity any longer. "What makes you different?" I asked bluntly. "You work with dying people all day, but you seem, I don't know, fulfilled somehow." Her smile was radiant. "I know where I'm going when I die, Leah, and I know that every person I touch here matters to the God who loves them more than I can imagine." "But you're not Jewish," I protested. "How can you know God loves you?" "Because his son told me so," she said simply, "and because that same son was Jewish as you are. He's your Messiah first, promised to your people for thousands of years." The word hit me like a physical blow. Messiah. Not the Greek Christ I could dismiss, but the Hebrew Mashiach our people had waited for through exile and persecution and hope deferred. When my father finally came home, I thought I could forget about Harriet and her dangerous ideas, but during the next Yom Kippur, as I stood in synagogue reciting prayers for atonement, her words echoed in my mind. We had no temple, no blood sacrifice, just endless cycles of hoping our good deeds would outweigh our failures. The most terrifying moment came during the Kol Nidri service. As the haunting melody filled the sanctuary, I found myself staring at the ark containing our Torah scrolls and thinking, what if Harriet is right? What if we missed him? The thought was so blasphemous I nearly gasped aloud. But once it took root, I couldn't shake it loose. Every prophecy I'd memorized, every Passover symbol, every sacrifice described in Leviticus, what if they all pointed to one person? What if the Messiah we'd been waiting for had already come, and we'd rejected him? I began having dreams about a man I'd never seen, speaking words that sounded both foreign and familiar. I'd wake with fragments of phrases echoing in my mind. Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham was, I am. The loneliness became unbearable. I couldn't discuss these thoughts with anyone in my community. Such questions were beyond heretical. My father, still recovering and dependent on my care, would have been devastated. The young women I taught would have been scandalized. I was trapped between the faith I'd inherited and the truth that was calling to me. 3 months after my father's discharge, I did something that would have horrified my ancestors. I secretly bought a New Testament. I told myself it was research, a way to understand what Christians believed so I could better refute it. But as I read those pages hidden in my apartment, everything I thought I knew began to crumble. The Jesus I discovered wasn't the foreign deity I'd imagined. He was thoroughly Jewish, celebrating Passover, teaching in the temple, fulfilling prophecies I'd known by heart my entire life. When he said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them but to fulfill them," something deep in my soul recognized truth. I didn't know then that my cousin Rachel had been watching me, had noticed my distraction during family gatherings, my new questions during Torah study. I had no idea that my carefully guarded secret was about to explode my world into fragments I'd never be able to piece back together. The moment that shattered my carefully constructed life came on a Tuesday morning, when I found myself praying to someone I'd been taught was blasphemy. 3 months of secret study had led to this breaking point where I could no longer pretend the evidence wasn't overwhelming. I'd been meeting secretly with Harriet every other week, ostensibly to thank her for my father's care, but really to ask the questions that were consuming me. She'd introduced me to Miriam, a messianic Jewish believer who showed me Isaiah 53 through new eyes. The prophecies I'd memorized as a child suddenly pointed to one person with devastating clarity. Look at verse 8. Miriam said during one of our clandestine meetings in a midtown coffee shop, "For the transgression of my people he was punished." Who are God's people? Leah, Israel. So this servant died for Israel's sins, not his own. I tried to argue, to find alternative interpretations, but the Hebrew was clear. Each Tuesday, I would tell my staff I had a client meeting in the Bronx, then slip away to Harriet's apartment where I kept my contraband New Testament hidden inside an old Tanakh cover. The cognitive dissonance was killing me. I was still conducting business, still hosting Shabbat dinners, still teaching the young women their weekly classes, all while wrestling with the possibility that everything I'd been taught was incomplete. The crisis came during Yom Kippur, the holiest day of our year. Standing in synagogue that evening, watching the final rays of sunset pierce through the stained glass, I was hit by a terrifying revelation. We had no blood sacrifice for our sins. The temple was gone, the priesthood was scattered. We were going through the motions of atonement, with no actual atonement available. For the first time in my 35 years, the ancient prayers felt hollow, like echoes in an empty room. As our congregation recited the Vidui, confessing our sins and begging forgiveness, I found myself thinking about the scapegoat described in Leviticus, the one animal that carried away the people's sins, never to return. Where was our scapegoat now? How could God forgive without the shedding of blood, as the Torah clearly required? The words of Jesus haunted me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. In my diamond merchant's office that night, Surrounded by the wealth that had earned my community's respect, I found myself whispering something that would have horrified my ancestors. Yeshua, if you're really the Messiah, show me. The response came not in thunder or visions, but in quiet certainty that flooded my soul. Every prophecy, every sacrifice, every promise in the Tanakh pointed to him, the suffering servant of Isaiah, the pierced one of Zechariah, the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. They were all the same person. My first genuine prayer to Yeshua came at midnight in my bedroom, hands trembling as I knelt beside my bed. If you are truly the Messiah our people have waited for, if you really died for my sins and rose from the dead, I surrender everything to you. But you have to understand, this will cost me everything I am. The peace that flooded my soul was unlike anything in my decades of religious observance. It wasn't the temporary emotional high I'd felt during particularly moving services, but a deep, settled assurance that I was finally home. I knew I could never go back to my old way of believing. The secret baptism was arranged through Harriet's underground network of Jewish believers. On a moonless night in November, I met a Messianic rabbi named David Rosenberg at a private home in New Jersey. As I stood waist-deep in that improvised mikveh, I felt the weight of 3,000 years of tradition pressing down on me. Leah bat Avram, the rabbi said softly, do you believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, the Son of the living God? I do, I whispered, and meant it with every fiber of my being. As the water covered me, I died to my old life and emerged with a new name, Martha, after the woman who first proclaimed Yeshua as the Messiah, the Son of God. I thought I could keep this transformation hidden while maintaining my position in the community. I was naive enough to believe I could have both worlds. But God had other plans. The following Shabbat, my cousin Rachel spotted me leaving what she later discovered was a Messianic congregation in Brooklyn Heights. I'd been careless, thinking nobody from my neighborhood would venture that far from our usual haunts. But Rachel had been visiting a potential match nearby and seen me embracing people she didn't recognize, looking peaceful in a way she'd never witnessed before. Within hours, my father's house was in chaos. Rachel had called an emergency family meeting, and by the time I arrived for our traditional Saturday evening meal, the entire extended family was there. Uncles, aunts, cousins, even my father's study partner from the yeshiva. How could you betray everything we are? My father raged, his face purple with a combination of grief and fury that terrified me. Your mother survived Buchenwald to preserve our faith, and you spit on her sacrifice? You're worse than Hitler, at least he only killed Jewish bodies. You're killing Jewish souls. The intervention that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. Rabbi after rabbi was brought in to argue with me, to show me the error of my ways, to convince me that I'd been brainwashed by missionaries. They forced me to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, certain that only mental illness could explain such apostasy. But the most devastating moment came when my father sat across from our dining room table and said quietly, I have no daughter. The Leah I raised died the day she accepted that false Messiah. You are a stranger to me now. The ultimatum was swift and final. Renounce this Jesus delusion publicly, or lose everything. My business, my standing, my family, my entire world. My cousins whispered about making sure I could never show my face in public again, and I knew they weren't speaking metaphorically. In Orthodox communities, apostates faced more than just shunning. Standing in my office for the last time, I ran my fingers across the velvet-lined displays where millions in diamonds once sparkled. Everything I'd worked for, everything I was, lay in ruins around me. But as I prepared to walk away from my entire life, one truth burned brighter than any precious stone: Yeshua was worth it all. I had crossed a line from which there was no return, and the real persecution was just beginning. The persecution had started small, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, canceled lunch dates, and suddenly changed appointments with my most loyal diamond clients. But after word spread through Brooklyn's Orthodox community about my secret baptism, the real storm hit with biblical fury. My father held a formal ceremony declaring me dead. I wasn't invited, but my aunt Rebecca described it later with tears in her eyes. He sat Shiva for you, Leah. 7 days of mourning as if you had died. Your picture was covered with a black cloth. Within a week, everything unraveled. The diamond exchange mysteriously revoked my trading privileges due to questions about character. Business partnerships dissolved overnight with lawyers citing moral turpitude clauses I'd never noticed in the contracts. My bank accounts were frozen after anonymous tips about suspicious activity. The community that had been my whole world for 35 years turned their backs as one coordinated movement. I thought financial ruin was the worst they could do, until my Aunt Rachel visited late one night, trembling as she spoke in whispers. "Martha." She caught herself using my new name, then shook her head. "Leah, you have to leave Brooklyn tonight," she insisted without telling me specifics. That night, I stayed in a tiny apartment in Queens, arranged by my new family at Beth Shalom Messianic Congregation. I remember sitting there that first night, staring at bare walls, everything I owned fitting in 2 hastily packed suitcases. The Shabbat candles remained unlit that Friday evening. The first time in my life I'd missed them. I wept, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Had I thrown away everything real for something imaginary? The Jesus who seemed so present during my private prayers felt distant now, overwhelmed by the tsunami of consequences. Where was the peace that surpassed understanding? Where was the abundant life he'd promised? That night, Yeshua met me in my darkness more tangibly than ever before. His presence filled that cramped room until I could barely breathe from the weight of his love. "Martha," he seemed to whisper directly to my soul. I too was rejected by my own people. I too was despised and acquainted with grief. But I endured the cross for the joy set before me, and part of that joy was you. Peace flooded my soul like water in a desert. I finally understood. He wasn't just worth losing everything for. He was everything I'd been searching for my entire life. My new family at the Messianic congregation became my lifeline. These were people who understood the cost of following Yeshua. Former rabbis, respected professionals, devoted mothers, all counted as dead by their communities for recognizing Jesus as Messiah. David Rosenberg, the rabbi who had baptized me, had lost his prestigious position at a major yeshiva. Lisa had been disowned by 7 generations of Orthodox heritage. Yet together we discovered that when you lose everything for Messiah, you find out he is more than enough. The final devastating blow came during Passover. Traditionally, I had always hosted the community Seder, my Upper West Side apartment stretching to accommodate 30 guests. This year, I sat alone in my tiny safe house, the bitter herbs tasting of real tears instead of symbolic remembrance. But as I lifted the matzah, the bread of affliction, something beautiful happened. For the first time in 52 previous Passovers, I saw with new eyes what I had missed. This was his body, broken for me. The cup of redemption held deeper meaning now. The blood of the Lamb painted on doorposts in Egypt pointed to the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. My people were still waiting for Messiah to come, while I had discovered he already had. The loneliness was crushing. No more Friday night dinners hosting rabbinical students. No more teaching young women about modesty and tradition. No more father beaming with pride at my business success. Instead, I had anonymous death threats, financial ruin, and a family that considered me worse than dead. But I also had something I'd never experienced in my 35 years of religious observance, intimate relationship with the living God. Yeshua wasn't a distant deity to be appeased through ritual. He was Emmanuel, God with us, closer than my own breath. 5 years have passed since my family declared me dead, and I still wake some mornings expecting to find that old life waiting for me. The diamond showroom, my father's proud smile, the familiar rhythms of Orthodox tradition. Instead, I find something I never thought possible, a love that has grown deeper through every loss, every threat, every moment of choosing Yeshua over everything else I once held dear. The Orthodox community's strategy of complete erasure nearly worked. For the first year, I battled depression so severe that some days I couldn't leave my small apartment in Queens. My new identity as Martha felt like an ill-fitting coat. I'd lost not just my business and family, but my entire sense of self. Who was I without the diamond exchange, without the respect of the community, without my father's approval? The answer came gradually, painfully, beautifully, through the underground network of Jewish believers who became my mishpacha, and through the man who would become my husband. I met Joshua Cohn at a Messianic Passover Seder during my 2nd year in exile. He was the cousin of Dr. Rachel Goldstein, one of the Jewish believers who had become like a sister to me. Joshua had his own story of costly faith. Formerly an investment banker from Manhattan's Upper East Side, son of a prominent conservative rabbi, He'd lost his position at Goldman Sachs when word spread about his conversion to Messianic Judaism. They couldn't fire me for religious discrimination, he told me during our first real conversation, but suddenly my deals started falling through, my clients found reasons to switch advisors, and my promotion track mysteriously stalled. Eventually they offered me a generous severance package to pursue other opportunities. What struck me wasn't his story. We all had versions of the same tale, but the peace in his eyes when he spoke about losing everything. At 38, he'd rebuilt his life as a financial consultant for small businesses, and there was a contentment in his manner that I recognized from my own journey. Our courtship was unlike anything I'd experienced in the Orthodox world. No shadchan arranged our meetings, no families negotiated compatibility. Instead, we discovered each other through shared study of the scriptures, through long conversations about how Yeshua fulfilled every prophecy we'd memorized as children, through the comfortable silences of two people who had lost everything and found it didn't matter. I never thought I'd want to marry again, Joshua confessed during one of our evening walks along the East River. The last woman my parents arranged, she called off the engagement the day after she learned about my faith, said she couldn't marry someone who betrayed our people. I understood completely. The Orthodox men they introduced me to wanted a wife who would defer to their religious authority. I replied. When they realized I had opinions about theology and business, they decided I was too modern for a proper Jewish home. Good thing we're not looking for proper anymore, he said, and something in his smile made my heart skip. Our wedding was small but beautiful. 25 Jewish believers gathered in the backyard of our Messianic rabbi's home in New Jersey. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and Joshua wore his grandfather's tallit under his suit jacket. Instead of breaking a glass to commemorate the destruction of the temple, we shared communion together, remembering the greater sacrifice that made all temple rituals complete. My father didn't walk me down the aisle. He didn't even know I was getting married. But David Rosenberg, the rabbi who had baptized me, performed that honor with tears in his eyes. Today you become not just husband and wife, he said in Hebrew, but partners in the great work of revealing Messiah to our people. The marriage transformed both our ministries. Joshua's business expertise helped me formalize my jewelry design work into a proper company. My connections in the diamond world, though strained, still existed among dealers who valued craftsmanship over community politics. Together we created something beautiful, a jewelry design studio that specialized in pieces incorporating biblical symbolism. Our small apartment in Queens became a different kind of gathering place than my old Orthodox Shabbat dinners, but infinitely more meaningful. Every Friday night we hosted other Jewish believers for worship that blended ancient Hebrew prayers with recognition of their fulfillment in Yeshua. Our dining room table saw conversations I'd never experienced in my father's house, raw discussions about the cost of following Messiah, joyful discoveries of how every Jewish holiday pointed to him, gentle debates about how to reach our families still trapped in partial truth. The hardest moments still come during holidays, especially when Joshua and I celebrate alone what should be family occasions. Passover can break my heart, remembering my father's pride as I led the Seder. But we've discovered something extraordinary. Every element points to Yeshua. The matzah that is broken and hidden and restored. The cup of Elijah that anticipates Messiah's return. The bitter herbs that represent the suffering he bore for us. Last week, Joshua and I walked past my father's diamond store together. The displays still sparkled with the same elegant brilliance, but they no longer held power over me. I've found a pearl of greater price, and in God's mercy, I found a partner who helps me treasure it. My name is Martha Cohn now, daughter of the King of Kings, wife to a man who loves Yeshua more than his own comfort. I am no longer the successful diamond merchant from Brooklyn's Orthodox community, nor the respectable single woman teaching modesty while secretly yearning for something more. I am a new creation in Messiah Yeshua, part of a love story that began in Abraham's tent and will end with the wedding feast of the Lamb.